Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's a Thursday morning. We're not going to talk about the cafe today, even though we'll be doing some exciting stuff. I'm glad you all have checked that out. I'm excited with the whole layout right now. It's pretty cool. Today, we're actually going to talk some jazz in a much stricter sense of that definition. We're going to talk about trumpets. And trumpets are a very interesting and unique instrument. I initially wanted to do the top 12 fire blowers, that just spit fire versus the kind of Cloud 9 guys that are kind of muted and melancholic, and having the kind of 12 middle of the road guys. But those lines get so blurred with some of those players that halfway through each list, you're like, well, do I put him here or here? Because most of these guys are capable of all three. The top level is kind of that virtuosity and clarity and enunciation. So all of your dynamics and acrobatics are clearly punctuated. They're clearly delineated, and they're fulfilled with strong breath through to the end of the idea. And then on top of that, they have melodic and rhythmic structure. So it's not just virtuosity pumping out notes. If you slow it down, there's actually melodic phrasing and interesting rhythm and pulsings that variate, but with precision and intent. And there's, the Freddie Hubbards, the Clifford Browns, the Booker Littles. These are the guys that are just so full of virtuosity that it emanates from their horn at almost all times. Armstrong was largely in this camp. A lot of fire, a lot of brightness in his sound, great clarity, a beautiful tonality. And so, but as I got a little deeper into my list, I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to present the trumpets of the modern jazz era. And of course, the modern jazz era for me is the 20s into late 60s, up to about 1970. So that means we're going to omit people like Wynton Marsalis, but we are going to include guys like Woody Shaw, who came in towards the end of the 60s. And I love Wynton. He's a great player and a very interesting personality and one of the great speakers in the jazz community. I think he's a great, powerful voice. But I'm just not going to cover that later era, in part because I don't have the collection to really speak on that level with the same degree of confidence and instruction. I can speak about the 50s and 60s with pretty great confidence. I have pretty much the entire canon of the jazz labels of that era. So I know who was making records and who was leading the pack and who was being innovative and who was following. And so I can speak fairly confidently about the swing era guys leading into bebop and hard bop and into the modal era, kind of going into the free and fusion era to some degree. So we're going to briefly look at 60 trumpet players. And the trumpet, again, is a very interesting instrument, in part because it comes from the European traditions of the classical orchestral setting and the German marching band traditions, bright and blurting, and a lot of pastoral kind of interesting classical pieces. The trumpet's a very varied instrument, and it allows its players to embody their own personality into it and how they play it, which is what leads to those different tiers of trumpet players, not in terms of ability or talent, because your personality will manifest differently, and you can't really compare personalities in that sense and list and categorize them. But you have the virtuoso guys are kind of in that top tier, just in terms of brightness and velocity and tempo and clarity and just real forceful when they play. You're like, you notice Nat Adderley when he picks up the cornet. He's one of those guys, you notice him when he goes to blow. And then you have that next middle range tier. And what separates these guys from the virtuosos is they're more blues based. And so they're less about that virtuosity and acrobatics and more about just the feeling of the blues, the preacher speaking and narrating, which sometimes omits acrobatics, because I have thought process that my mind is going through, and I'm expressing notes in a pulsing and rhythmic and conversational way. And only the great acrobatics can still remain conversational and melodic and not get too caught up in the acrobatics. I mean, Clifford Brown kind of breaks all the barriers and does it all with soul and feeling and melody and rhythm. Clifford Brown's such kind of an anomaly. And other guys kind of, I know Hubbard is, of course, one of the greatest talents of all time. His dynamics and acrobatics are just incredible. His ability to play ballads is pretty unrivaled. He's a beautiful ballad player. But again, so the middle tier, which is more your Donald Byrds and your Blue Mitchells, Lee Morgan's kind of on the edge between 1 and 2. He can be very forceful and very acrobatic, but he's more bluesy in feel. And he's got a lot to say and express all the time, which I think will mitigate and limit the acrobatics, because I got something coming up from my heart right now that I just gotta get out. And so sometimes if I have to get somewhere in my car, doing a bunch of spinoramas and whippies and shitties and all the different things may not be my best interest right now, because I'm trying to get to a place, a destination. So some of the acrobatics will take a back seat. And it's not necessarily saying that they're not capable of these acrobatics, but it's the blues that is their primary message and influence and where they want to speak from. And so Byrd always has the R&B in them, the blues and the rhythm and the gospel and the church. And you see Donald Byrd kind of always inflecting the blues and the church in a lot of his music. He even makes some gospel influenced records with the church in the mid '60s at Blue Note. You know, and it's the church is such a big part of the black community in America throughout history. It's been a place of solace and a place of comfort, and it's been interwoven with the fabric of black music throughout the history, from the gospel into the blues, into the jazz, into the rhythm and blues. It's pretty hard to extricate the black church from the black experience. Most of the great black singers got their first vocal test in their local Baptist church. You know, and that goes from Al Green and Aretha Franklin back to singers like Al Hibbler, Billie Holiday, and Ella Fitzgerald. The church is so part of the equation, which leads to a lot of the call and response of the church. You know, where the pastor will say blah, 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 and the choir will be like, blah, blah, blah. That back and forth, that dialogue. Jazz embodies that all the time when two great players are kind of exchanging content, spiritual makeup, consciousness, my deep inner social political ideology, my philosophy. I can spout all that into my horn. Can you hear what I'm saying? Oh, you feel that? Okay, yeah, you weren't there with that. Okay. See what I'm saying? It's a conversation, it's a dialogue. And the virtuosos and those kind of bluesier based players, I mean, they're interchangeable, but you're going to find Byrd more in a bluesier camp and less trying to just be showy. And you're going to find Freddie Hubbard more doing acrobatics on a regular basis, even though he has the blues in him. So again, it's very hard to differentiate. You can just say one is tinged more in that way or tinged more in the other way. And you have kind of the third group of trumpet players, what I call the Cloud 9 players. And they're very influenced by Sweets Edison, the mute, lyrical, sweet playing, almost talking to you like you're a woman. I mean, just giving you some sweet, syrupy sugar that I'm a fly, I just gotta buzz around that. I need to get closer to that little syrup puddle because, man, ooh, that's some good juice. And I like that sweet syrup. And so guys like Chet Baker, Miles Davis, Art Farmer, you know, have a lot of that sweet, melancholic often. Again, the blues is part of that equation as well. And most of these guys in this camp are equally capable of playing with some acrobatics at times, to a lesser degree generally. They usually tend to go more towards the Sweet Edison sound because their acrobatics, their capacity to play bebop and hard bop, they're just not quite that same. And again, I don't think it's ability, I think it's personality. takes a certain amount of personality and aggression. And that's part of how you interact with the world, that aggression. And so if you ain't an aggressive person in terms of how you confront your day, it's hard to muster that in your horn and almost be fake. You can't just blow hard bop if you ain't feel hard bop. You can't just be Chuck D if you ain't angry about it all. Or Zach De La Rocha from Rage Against the Machine. You can't just get up there and fake vitriol. You know, it comes from the soul, it comes from the heart, it comes from the wisdom of seeing the evil that men do. And recognizing, man, we should be able to do better than this, and my people deserve more justice. And that anger is a focused, aggressive release of that experience. But you can't fake it. If you are kind of a bitter, if you're insecure, if you're heartbroken, Chet Baker or Miles Davis, Sweet Edison, these guys, they'll tug at your heartstrings. And it's funny how different the trumpet can sound in the hands of a Sweet Edison versus a Clifford Brown. And so there's three real dynamic tiers, and all trumpet players, for the most part, can lash between those tiers, but most of them are focused on one and are known for one thing. They're all capable of doing many things. You know, Miles came up in bebop, was never a great bebopper, probably wasn't even a great hard bopper. But when it comes to the mute and playing melancholic and cerebral hemorrhaging of that sadness, Miles could push that into that trumpet with the best of them. I mean, so you can be the best in different ways. It's a bit like basketball. Artis Gilmore, Kentucky Colonels, ABA. You can excel at different facets of the game and still be very valuable to the team. And so some guys might be great at blocking shots and rebounding and defending. Other guys might be great at passing and handling the ball. Other guys might be great at shooting. Other guys might be great in transition and dunking. And they're all different facets. And of course, today's players are getting to the point where they're all kind of embodying more and more of that skill set. But with music, especially back in this time frame, the honesty of my personality is reflected in my playing. It's one of the great things about jazz. It doesn't allow for you to be phony. You can't fake it and feel it. That's just not a way you can play the blues or play jazz. But the interesting thing about the trumpet, like I said, it was a European instrument. And this is going to be the same for a lot of these jazz instruments is as I go through this. If I make this into a series, if people enjoy this enough. But to take another person's instrument, another culture's instrument, and to reinvent it completely, and to make it an instrument of party, celebration, to make it a music of expressing history and sorrow, and to make it this instrument that's improvised virtuosity that's different every time you do it, based on how I feel today and what's going on in the background around me, in my world, in the greater world at large. It's such a unique transition for an instrument. And again, jazz will have this with the saxophone and with the trombone. A lot of the horns especially will really get transformed by these jazz musicians without formal training most of the time. Never really probably even understanding what its use was intended for. They take it and just so change its texture and its context that in the world today, if you ask the average person, again, this is my perspective, I could be wrong, but I think if you ask the average person to name the 5 most famous trumpet players, I have a hard time thinking Miles Davis and Louis Armstrong aren't going to be on that list. You know, Dizzy Gillespie, I mean, I don't think he's quite as well known in the non-jazz world as Louis and Miles are. But it's almost like you took soccer or a rugby ball and reinvented some kind of beach game that was totally different rules and not even, and then the world becomes connected to that ball, that activity, by these people who are kind of doing it wrong. I mean, and I'm sure there are some pretty famous classical trumpet players, probably in America and in Europe, that I'm not in that circle to know. Are they everyday names and household names that people who watch football on Sundays will be able to name? Not in America, I don't think so. You know, I mean, there's probably some Harvard graduates with a monocle that could be like, oh, Sergio Ilicevic from Serbia is the greatest trumpet player in the world. And I'm sure there are some incredible players from that idiom. But I think the trumpet, for a lot of people, is associated with jazz now. And it's kind of a stolen identity. It's kind of an undercover cop, you know? And I think that speaks to the power of this art form, the power of the expression of what these men and women had to say. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to present to you some of my trading cards. And this list isn't done yet. With the shop and all stuff that's been going on in the coffee shop, I've not been able to finish my trading card series. I'm into the 500s. I have mapped out about 693. So almost 700. It keeps it an even number of pages and stuff in the book for trading cards. 693. So I have about 15 or 16 more trumpet players that I'm going to be adding to this list eventually. But with the 520 or so that I've done, it leaves us about 60 trumpet players. And there's some great names to come on this list. You know, Webster Young, Tony Frisella, Doc Cheatham I haven't done yet. So some pretty named players. But for the most part, the 60 I'm about to show you are probably the biggest names in jazz trumpet from the 20s up until about 1970. And a lot of these guys continue into the 70s and 80s, of course. But the trumpet kind of falls out of favor in jazz in the 60s, which it seems counterintuitive because Miles Davis owned jazz in the 60s. But the next generation of cats doesn't really show up. And you get some Ted Kursons, and you get Don Cherry, who's kind of, you know, late 50s already with Ornette, you know, Woody Shaw, of course, Wynton Marsalis. There is some traditional trumpet players, but the free and avant-garde jazz that comes up in the 60s into the 70s just doesn't seem to attract trumpet players like it does saxophonists. And then, of course, organ players and guitar players start springing up everywhere in the 60s. And trumpet players kind of start to disappear. Trombone players even more so. But for the first 20, 30 years of jazz, the trumpet players were the stars of jazz. Going back to the great Buddy Bolden, who, again, lives in legend and myth, to the great King Olivers and Freddie Kephards and Louis Armstrongs and the New Orleans Sound, all the way into the entire migration of the black diaspora into the American continent. They're bringing these great players up for literally 3 generations. From the Roy Eldridges, the Dizzy Gillespies, and the Sweets Edisons, into the bebop era with the Fats Navarros and Howard McGee's and Miles Davises, into the hard bop era with all those great cats at Blue Note. It's a pretty impressive list of 60 men, the great players in the swing bands of Basie and Ellington. These are important people. And so these 60 people I'm going to show you will represent just how broad the jazz kingdom is. And as I flip through these players, count in your head how many of them you know or have music by them. Because it'll just really drive home how broad the jazz canon is. Most of these players have records on the big labels in jazz. And by the big labels, I'm talking the top 50 or 60 jazz labels, including the 20 big ones and all the micro ones. These people were like part of the canon. And some have slipped into more obscurity today than others. But if you want to get a true vision of what the great trumpet players were, and how many of them there are, and how varied jazz is, and the backgrounds and the different sounds, both black and white, it's quite a varied and incredible expanse of music. And there's no question that everybody on this list is worthy of delving into. Okay, I've kind of omitted some of the more obscure things, and like I said, there's parameters in terms of going forward in the modern times. But in terms of that 1920 to 1970, that 50 years, this 60 people are all verified by the Jazz Shepherd. And I can tell you Scott Baldwin and Jean-Michel, Richard Beethoven, Ken McCullough, a lot of these people who know the music as well as I do, or better in some cases, would tell you these are all 60 people that are of utmost importance. And if you guys dig this little piece on the trumpet and this little visual feed of trumpet players, let me know in the comments, because I can do one for drums, bass, piano, all the different instruments. I can do a video like this with the 500 or so cards I've already done. And I think it's a great way to kind of give yourself a visual guide to players I should be looking for, players I know and love, and just what do I need to learn more about. And these guys are all in various degrees responsible for the development of the trumpet, brought certain elements, certain mutes, certain tricks and games and plays and sounds and bravados, all kinds of vibratos. There's different things each player brings to the game. And learning all that takes a lifetime, you know. But this is a great place to look at that body of work and that baseline and be like, okay, these are 60 guys I need to keep my eyes and ears open for. That's a big number, 60. And you could certainly take the top 30, but you're still going to be omitting some really important players. So from swing to bebop, from New Orleans to hard bop, into free and avant-garde, these are the people that you really kind of got to tip your hat to and say, this was jazz from the trumpet. So without further ado, let's let these cards roll, and I think you guys will enjoy this. I'm proud of that. I put a lot of work in that over the last year. It's been about a year now since I started these cards, and I'm looking forward to finishing them, because it's I put a lot of heart, sweat, and tears into it, so I want to see the fruition of it. But using them in these episodes, I think, is also just as useful and just as valuable. So enjoy the little montage of 60 great trumpet players. They're not in any particular order. They just run from the sequence number on the trading cards, which is a pretty random number. And the earlier in the series, the players do tend to be more famous and important. But the first 300 names or so are all fairly equal footing in a lot of ways. Just in terms of the broader your knowledge is, the more you recognize these are all important people. And the next 300 cards are second-tier players on some level in terms of fame, but they're all still very important and part of the deal. And so it's really these last 15, 16 names, which I haven't done yet, that are starting to become more peripheral and temporal and short-term. You know, a guy like Webster Young wasn't on the scene very long. Doc Cheatham, it's a pretty big name. There's some pretty big names still coming. So without further ado, if you appreciate the channel, please subscribe. If you want to help support the channel, go to my Patreon page and pledge a few dollars a month. It's always appreciated. It's helping me keep afloat right now. I don't have time to work much because I'm getting this coffee shop together, but we're fine. We're blessed. So we'll talk to you all soon. Have a great day. Peace.